You are listening to a TechSide Network podcast, TechSide.net, casual conversation from technically passionate people.
This podcast contains harsh language and covers adult topics. You will be challenged by views with which you do not agree. We may not be politically correct, but we are correct about politics. Today we have a special guest, none other than FrogMachine. I became aware of this gentleman through some objectivist channels, and I've only grown more fascinated. Mr. Machine lives in Japan, where he teaches English as a second language. He's studying to become a therapist. He makes YouTube videos discussing psychological topics, and he sings! The last time I saw a singing frog was on the WB. Mr. Machine is a student of objectivism like myself, and brings that perspective to psychology in a unique and refreshing way. Every time I speak with him, I wind up learning something, which prompted me to ask him here. FrogMachine, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
We are glad to have you. You're a bit of a polymath, and I'd like to dig a little into that, but first I have to ask the trite question. What is with the name?
Yeah, a lot of people are curious about the name of FrogMachine. The original takeaway from it is that I'm a big fan of a group called Infected Mushroom. They're a psychedelic trance group.
Yes.
From Israel, and I've loved their music for over a decade now. And there was a song that they made in I'm the Supervisor, one of their albums, called FrogMachine. And for some reason, that song really resonated with me. I really like the sound of it. I really like the build-up and the momentum, because I used it a lot for when I was painting and studying and doing things like that. So it gets me into a flow state, and I just decided to take that name up. And plus, when I think of frogs are amphibious, and they're very resilient to nature. They learn to grow in mud. They learn to, prosper in their own little ways. And I was like, thinking about it from a metaphorical perspective, the frog can jump into the mud, into the murky depths, which I consider now the subconscious, take out all the junk, jump back out into the clearing, and be okay. And if anyone touches them, they get poisoned. So the machinery is always turning with the frogs, and that's kind of why I like the frogs.
Well, I'm looking to turn the lever on the FrogMachine today. So you're living in Japan. What drew you there?
This is a funny question, because there are a couple of reasons why, and I have to be honest about it. I like Asian girls, that's one point, and I'm not going to lie about that. I like Asian girls, but that wasn't the only reason I went to Japan. It was an influencing factor, though. It was a motivating factor. But I've always liked Japanese history, in particular the Warring States period, or in Japanese they call it the Sengoku Jidai, where you had a lot of the clans fighting for like a good century or something like that. So, for example, like Oda Nobunaga, who's a pretty popular figure in Japan, Date Masamune, Takeda Shingen, and all them. So I was really interested in the historical nature of Japan and its culture, and I've read into a lot of like what the samurai actually were. Pro tip, they were pretty brutal. So I was fascinated in that, but also at the time when I decided to start doing ESL, I decided to go to Japan because it was a challenge, and when I decided to do that, I was also in like a darker place in my life. And what I mean by that is that I was unsure of myself. I didn't know what I wanted, and I was much younger than I am now. I'm 30 now, and at the time I was 22, 23. And then, I decided I'm going to go to another country. I'm just going to jump in and give myself a big challenge. And I decided Japan because, it's economically a pretty decent country. Stagnant, but decent. It's safe. The girls are cute. So what the hell? Just go for it, And it turns out I really enjoy the teaching as well, because I studied right before I came here.
That's awesome. Well, you are in Japan, you sing, you teach English to Japanese students, you produce YouTube videos, and you're training to become a therapist. These skills seem eclectic, wide-ranging. Tell me, what unites them? What is your passion?
I don't really have a passion in terms of concretes like that. I have thought about this a lot because when I look at how other people live their lives and what other people do, not everyone, of course, but just from observation, like people get really focused on specific things. Like I'm going to be like a receptionist or a secretary or a singer and just that, right? But I've never been satisfied doing just one thing. I've tried doing it. I was in IT for a little while when I was younger. Couldn't handle it. I didn't like it because it was just very static for me. And then I also got into journalism. When I was 19, I was a freelance journalist for a gaming website. You can actually find my reviews online as well. So I got into writing, and I really like writing, and I always kept to it. And then after that, I wanted to do new things, so I strived for that. And then I wanted to teach, so I strived for that. And then I wanted to do counseling, so I strived for that. Then I want to learn how to sing, and I want to learn how to paint. And I've studied animation, I've studied modeling. There are so many things that I really, really like. And I've just noticed that it's something, I guess the passion is the desire to learn and command several skills to build greater things for myself, to build an integrated kind of product. And when I do my, say, psychology videos and counseling stuff, well, I'll distinguish it. It's actually counseling, not particularly psychology, but with psychological elements. When I do the counseling stuff, a lot of it is an integration rather from so many different elements of my life, like from experiences, from the skills I have, from the singing I do, from the art that I love, from the art that I do. So in essence, it's this desire to want to understand the world and build myself to be better constantly, because I don't think there's an end goal in being better. It's a journey to being the best you can be while you've got time on Earth. So
you're a bit of a Renaissance man, you could say.
Yes, I can actually attribute the Renaissance man identification to a guy on a server. You probably might have heard of him. His name's Joe. He's also a student of Objectivism, and he once said, "You're quite the Renaissance man." And when he said that to me, it was like a light in my mind just bursting on, just turning on. I was like, that's what I am. You know, I want to learn. I want to completely develop myself and continue developing myself and just expanding my skill base. Now, there are things I'm not interested in. I'm not interested in absolutely everything. Like, I'm a terrible dancer, and I don't think I'm ever going to be a good dancer. But it's just this desire to learn and revere in the aspects of reality that make it great for me. And I think that's part of it. It's a love for learning. It's a love for becoming something better.
If only there were more people like you. So not everything interests you, but you do teach English as a second language, and that's something that I could never do. I do have an amateur's interest in different languages and accents that interest me, but I can barely speak English. So it's an impressive skill to me to not only teach, but to do so in, of course, two different languages, and one so dissimilar as Japanese. So what interests you about this field?
Well, when I started doing it, I mean, to kind of contextualize it as well, I don't use Japanese in my language teaching, actually. I didn't even know any Japanese when I started teaching. I just jumped into Japan with maybe 1 or 2 words of Japanese under my belt, and then I just self-taught everything. I was like, all right, I'm going to study the language and do this. And I'm not a professional or a high-level speaker. I'm like intermediate conversational level, but that's adequate for living in Japan and speaking with people and getting by and doing my taxes, which is unfortunately a reality that I have to do as well. But I digress. Going into like teaching, I can identify it now, but at the time it was, I've noticed that I've always been good at explaining things. I'm very clean in my speaking. I have clarity of speech, and that was a skill I've always had. So, and I liked working with people in that sense. So I was like, oh, you know, I'm going to give teaching a shot. And I went into it and I started really enjoying it. And nowadays I'm moving into counseling and things like that, which we'll get into a little later as well. But the reason I went into it is because I recognized explicitly what it is that I love about this, and it's building people up to be better than they can be. And part of it is working with kids. I think kids need that kind of guidance and need that kind of actualization so they can become like Renaissance kids in a sense. Because when I teach in groups and in classes, it's fun. And I love working with all the kids and doing like ESL lessons and stuff, and I know how to do it all. And I even wrote a book on language, how we form it from an objectivist perspective, and then how we can teach it. But I always noticed that the most pleasure I got in this field is coaching one-on-one with the kids and teaching them to win their speech contests. And I can proudly say that most of the speech contests we've had is like they've won, they've come first, or they've beaten everyone on a state level. So it's pretty great.
So you have a book that teaches, or rather that explains learning languages from an objectivist perspective, and I didn't know that, so I'll ask you for a link that I can put in the show notes to that book. I'll be checking it out. I suggest our listeners do too. How did you first learn about objectivism?
I remember a couple of years ago, I was never into politics. As Obi-Wan Kenobi says, "Oh, I'm not brave enough for politics." It's not my area. I have zero interest in getting into these like huge debates about immigration and things like that. It's not my area. But I got involved in politics because of the 2016 elections and stuff. And also just before that, I started reading a bit more on things. And I remember just kind of passively saying, yeah, I guess I'm a libertarian or an ANCAP because the state intervention is bad. And that's kind of how I went about it, right? But then I remember reading a quote, and I can't remember where I read it, but it lit up something in my mind. And the quote was, "The man who does not value himself cannot value anything or anyone." And I was like, who wrote that? And it was Ayn Rand. I was like, where is that from? And it came from, I think it was Virtue of Selfishness. And I was like, wow, I like that. That's really interesting. So I started doing some exploring, and I got a copy of The Virtue of Selfishness. So I started from the nonfiction section of her work. And I started reading it, and I was like, damn, this is really logical. This is very grounded in reality. It's looking at like organisms and how they're self-generating, and life is the standard of value, and this is why self-interest is moral, but self-interest doesn't mean hedonism and, killing people to benefit you. It doesn't mean any of that. And she wrote this really eloquent book where it just stunned me. I was really surprised at what she was saying. I was like, this is quite accurate, because when I think back in my life and I think back in how I applied myself in certain ways, every time I was altruistic, like putting people above me, and I was quite altruistic when I was young, letting people step over me and things like that, I became very resentful. But when I asserted myself, I became very good, high self-esteem, and I felt very good, and people respected me more as well. So there was that element, and I started to take it in, and then I really dug into the philosophy after I decided to buy The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. I bought those two books to read because I like stories, and I read through The Fountainhead in like a week, 2 weeks. I was just consuming it. Atlas Shrugged in about 3-4 because it's quite a big book. And that was at the point I was like, yeah, I like this stuff. This is really good. I think this is pretty damn valid. And then I jumped into objectivist epistemology, and also Brandon's work in psychology of self-esteem, because psychology has always been my interest. And yeah, that's when it all just kind of clicked into place in my brain. I was like, yeah, okay, this is the shit, basically. So that's how I kind of went into objectivism, so to speak.
This is the shit, indeed. You heard it here first, folks. So was Nathaniel Brandon what made you take up the mantle of counseling, or was it something else?
It was mainly in my experiences with the teaching. That illuminated my interest in helping people. But the psychology and the counseling stuff is a little personal as well, because I've always been interested in the mind and how we think about things and how we feel. Because when I was young, I had really significant anxiety, like to the point of not going to school sometimes because I would freeze and I would panic. And when I was 6 years old in particular, like I remember vividly, I couldn't even go into my third grade school classes. Like my classroom, like I was just outside the door and I would freeze. I was terrified out of my mind. I was just having panic attacks and shutdowns and things like that. And it became an interest to me last year. That's when I started studying counseling, doing a diploma in it. because I was like, yeah, I really like helping people, but it really became apparent as to why I love this so much, because I thought a lot about where my anxiety comes from and where, rather came from, because I'm very normalized right now, where it came from and all these things. And it came from parts of my life that were very painful to me. And something that I really like about a particular psychologist, a clinical psychologist named Stephen Hayes, he often says the quote, "We hurt where we care." And that may sound as malevolent on a superficial level, but when you think about that, why do we hurt over the things? Why do we hurt over specific memories? Why do we take trauma and pain in that way? And why do we reflect on it so much? And we fight it really often because we don't want to feel pain. But when you look at it, when you examine it, you realize that it's something that deeply mattered to you, and you shouldn't be fighting it. You should be taking in those memories and experiences and finding what it was about that mattered to you so much. And through that, I found my passion of counseling and psychology. It really lights up my world. I'm really interested in it because I didn't have a lot of the help that I want to give to people in the world. I didn't have that kind of support and guidance in that way. Not to say that my life with my parent was bad. My mother was an amazing woman, but there were a lot of issues in my life that I was dealing with, and I didn't have someone to guide me and to help me build up my confidence and not make me feel like I'm helpless. So that's part of what got me into psychology and counseling. And I think with objectivism and egoism in particular, you can really build people up to be amazing individuals if done correctly.
So this next one is a big question, so I'm going to give you the floor for a while. What effect do you think the ideas presented in objectivism have had on your understanding of the treatment of mental disorders?
So I think that with objectivism, I'm able to recognize that there are certain deterministic practices in the treatment of mental disorders. And what I mean by this is that people would panic, or they would have anxiety attacks, or they would go through something, and they would go to their therapist, they would go to their psychiatrist, and they would be prescribed medication. And the reason they're prescribed medication is because they deduced that they have panic disorder, or they have generalized anxiety disorder. That's something that, I was diagnosed with myself, generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. And a lot of these things, they talk about how, well, that was conditioned into you. You know, you're conditioned that way from your childhood experiences, or some people have like an imbalance in their brain, and that's a different factor. But a lot of it is highly deterministic in psychology. It's saying that you've been conditioned this way, and this is why you have that, therefore you need like medication and stuff. And that's so wrong, because that's telling people that the war inside them is not fixable. It's only pacifiable. Right? So like taking pills and stuff is what you need, or just constant therapy, or constant solution-focused therapy, things like that. And I think objectivism in its conception of free will really illuminates that a lot of these things aren't necessarily unfixable, metaphysically given facts. And this isn't to pay disrespect to people with genuine disorders. Like, I'm not sure on my position on bipolar, for example, because bipolar has significant movements in moods with chemical imbalance. Now, what the cause of that is, I don't know, and I don't think anyone really knows. They do say there's like evidence for genetic, but I'm not willing to take my stance on that, and I have full respect and sympathy for people who go through those things. So there's no negation of those facts. But for people who suffer from like generalized anxiety and panic attack and things like that, they've been taught that this is conditioned into them and it's almost deterministic. But I look at it and go, well, no, you have free will, and free will means not just the will to act in reality and like externally of you and to choose and things like that, but also to focus your awareness on the internal world inside you, which is, you know, your anxiety, your pain. And the psychological world tends to, you've probably seen it yourself, like all these self-help books of eliminate anxiety and destroy depression and get rid of the pain you feel. It's all pacification of pain on a mental level. And we're not talking about the physical. The physical is like if you have a wound, you heal it. You cauterize the wound and heal it, right? But in the internal, you can't run away from pain. You can pacify it, but it comes back. That's the war within, you know?
I do.
And objectivism, yeah. Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say this will come up a little later, but on YouTube there's this gentleman, Jordan Peterson, and some people have different views on him, but I find that when he sticks to his lane, he has some decent views. I was actually dealing with some recurring thoughts. And they were darker thoughts. So I have a baby, right, a child, and I couldn't get out of my head what would happen if something terrible happened to him. And it just kept playing over in my mind for months. And then I saw him speak once he was answering a question, and he took a moment to think, and I will paraphrase it, but he said, if you keep pushing it away, your brain's trying to warn you, right, of a potentially disastrous situation, and you're telling it to shut up. So it's just going to yell louder, right? Yeah. And of course, this is just paraphrasing. He used better words than I am, but it's just going to get stronger, and it's going to keep coming back. And so what you need to do is actually sit and let the pain wash over you. Let this moment happen, and then think about what would happen next. Because you immediately think, I would fall apart, everything would end. But is that actually true? No, you would take steps. You still have a family that you need to take care of, and you have a life. And as absolutely grotesque as it may seem in the moment, you will get past it. This too shall pass. And I did that. I sat there in the dark and closed my eyes and thought about that awful scene, and I thought about what I would do next, and what I would do next, and what I would do next. And eventually, after doing that a couple of times, that passed, and I haven't had that again. And it freed me from, I unnecessarily suffered for months. And one of the great things about objectivism, the reason these two, I think, gel so well, is that Rand puts a lot of emphasis on joy, and says that pain and suffering are inconsequential. They're not the focus. They shouldn't be the focus of your life. Painful experiences are to be understood, used, and then discarded. Right. So you may have a traumatic experience where you fall off of your skateboard and break your leg. Well, you could just wallow in pain for the rest of your life and never get on a skateboard again, or you could understand what happened. You could change your ways and then move on with your life, get on a skateboard again, for this very infantile example. And I have found in speaking with a number of counselors and yourself in general, that the psychological field is moving in a way that I find very encouraging, because when I took, Psychology 101, it was still all about Freud and what's his bloody name with the bells? Pavlov.
Pavlov, yes.
And it's all about conditioning and positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and it basically turns the psyche into chemical predisposition. So what I'd like to ask you is, what new developments in the psychological field interest you the most?
I'd say it's Stephen Hayes' work in acceptance and commitment therapy. I'm not that into the research and things like that, but I'm more into the practical application, because I do believe the moral is the practical. There is use in the scientific method and applying, certain research and facts to the field, of course, but that's not my area. So acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, is all about accepting the feelings and thoughts that come through you, whether they be unpleasant or pleasant. And it's learning to become an observer of those things rather than being fused to those thoughts. And I think that this form of therapy is precisely the kind of like almost the renaissance point of psychology in some sense, because it is starting to accept emotions as they are rather than as pain, pleasure things where it's, oh, okay, this emotion is bad, I shouldn't feel it. And it's also starting to while it may not explicitly say so, it's starting to recognize the importance of free will and the importance of choice, because a lot of people feel like when they have anxiety attacks and panic attacks and the ruminations, they feel like they don't have a choice in the matter. They feel like they don't have the choice to get rid of those things. Like, it's just part of me. It's like, yes, it's part of you, but you have a choice to focus on it. You have a choice to not focus on it. And it doesn't mean that you should avoid the thoughts and avoid the feelings. It means you should observe it and notice that it's there, like a spectator almost, because it comes from somewhere. Now, if you want to introspect and figure out where it comes from, you can do that, but don't judge it on like a moral scale. You have to accept the things that are inside you, own your thoughts, own your feelings, and recognize that they aren't exactly you. So I think that area in psychology is probably the best area because it's practical, it's real, it's not treating people like a bunch of chemicals that just can't change how they are in a lot of ways. Like the conditioning and all that. But I think that the elements of conditioning do have some use in the sense that you can train yourself to build better habits based on like conditioning principles. It's just that we're now omitting those fundamental aspects of if you do this, you're determined to be this way. Like it all comes from how you act and react to those principles rather than you apply the principles and you just act like a dog. It's nothing like that. So yeah, I'd say Stephen Hay's work in the field has been really great, and that's what I'm mainly focusing on in the field of psychology and counseling.
That's what always really bothered me about psychology and drove me away from the field, frankly. I had an interest in psychology, and the more I read into it, the more it was either the mystical over with Freud, where your feelings for your girlfriend come from, your feelings towards your mother, and
Right.
cigars are phallic objects, and you must like performing fellatio. It was just this bizarre notions. And then on the other side, you had all of these things that reduced man to a number of impulses, like Pavlov. And it was a choice between mysticism and determinism, and neither of them felt right to me. And so I'm very glad when I learned about CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, I looked at that and I said, this is a rational worldview being applied to psychology, and I am behind this. And then ACT sounds a lot like that, but it leads me into my next question, actually, which is that you and I have spoken a few times about the importance and epistemological value of emotions. My understanding from an objectivist framework is that emotions are an end result only. Emotions as such can't tell us anything about the world outside, or if something is true or not. So how does that square with your studies of psychology?
Well, before I answer the question explicitly, just going back quickly to CBT and ACT, the reason CBT works isn't because you're attacking the thoughts, it's because you're separating them from you. That's actually the reason why it tends to work for people, because when they externalize the thought, they can see it as an observer. The only problem with CBT is that it goes into the whole principle behind... Their principle is basically, these thoughts are bad, so we should get rid of them. But you can't get rid of what's inside you. You have to observe it. And
so we'll come back to the question in a second. Let me actually let's rap about this for a second.
Sure.
My understanding of CBT was that you recognize that there is a disconnect, or that you have this negative emotion. And I don't know if you would argue with this, but there are negative emotions in your estimation. Yes.
I don't call them negative. Emotions
Okay.
are just emotions. And the reason I say this is because when I say negative, what's the first thing you think of?
Pain.
Pain, exactly. Positive,
Joy.
joy. Okay. So you've applied a value judgment to those two concepts, right? And what happens when we apply negative and positive to emotions? The descriptor of negative and positive to emotions is we suddenly apply that value judgment implicitly. And the problem with judging your emotions in that way is that you're saying you should not be feeling it, even though emotions only exist in the present. So this is a temporal question. I don't want to feel pain is a valid kind of premise because you don't want to be in pain, right? But if you feel pain, You shouldn't be saying, I don't want to feel this, because you're already feeling it. It's a present moment thing, and you need to be present with it to examine it and to acknowledge it. Because rejecting it creates repression. That's what happens when people repress their anger or repress certain emotions or past memories. So applying that kind of value judgment is basically saying that you are not allowed to feel these things, which is different to I don't want to feel them, but if I go through an experience which makes me feel them, that's fine, because that's reality. So hopefully I explained that a little clearly.
You surely did. It's so the way I understood it was, let's say you have anxiety about getting on public transport, right? Getting on the bus. You have anxiety about that, and you're not really sure why, but you know that it's a problem, right? It's preventing you from doing something that you want to do. Using CBT, you would kind of deconstruct why you have this reaction, and then you would correct your thing, because it is possible that is irrational. It's also possible that it's perfectly rational to have that kind of emotion. But this is where we get into the next question, so I'll save that. That CBT would be used to break down that particular process and then rebuild your thought process so that you no longer have that negative reaction to this neutral stimuli. But what you're saying is that saying that anxiety is negative automatically puts you at odds with an emotion that you're already having, and that you shouldn't go into any kind of a problem like that. That you should accept that you have this feeling, recognize it for what it is, and then continue about your therapy.
Yes, because so CBT challenges the thoughts that you have. So for example, you always think, I'm not good at X, and you would write it down, and you would one of the exercises I give on one of my YouTube videos is you challenge the thought through for and against kind of write-ups. So you write, what's evidence for this thought? What's evidence against this thought? And what that ends up doing is it deconstructs the thought that you had, and it challenges it, and it makes you feel good, because it's like, okay, so I've devalued the significance of this thought, so it's not that important to me anymore. And I think that's important, but the main factor that makes it feel better is that you're separating yourself from the thought. You're helping yourself separate from it. It's called cognitive fusion, or rather diffusion in this case. And it's really important to recognize feelings that you have, because again, as I said, if you push down feelings, they will come back in different areas. Now, the cause of the feeling, the cause of the anxiety of getting on a bus, for example, there is a reason for it. And it's to do with how you've integrated your emotional, your emotions and your thoughts, or rather how you see the world in a certain way based on past experiences. So it's really interesting to note, like when you look at, say, kids who get bullied, like a kid who gets bullied and then comes out completely fine in the future. He's like, they were just bullies. But then you look at another 6-year-old kid who gets bullied, and maybe the same degree of bullying, and he comes out anxious as hell. Why is that? It's not because of the experience conditioned them, but it's how they reacted to the experience. And then when they have that anxiety later on in whatever circumstance, the anxiety itself is not correct. The anxiety itself is not wrong. It is a feeling that you feel, and that's fine. You have to accept the feeling, because if you fight it, you're telling yourself that it's not okay to feel this way. And letting it in allows you to observe it and to go, okay, I'm feeling this way. That's okay. Now, what was the negative experience that led me to feel this way in this situation? Because rationally, we can talk rationally about things all the time. It's like, rationally, I shouldn't be afraid of going on a bus, because this is what happens with people who suffer from anxiety. They're like, I shouldn't feel anxious about getting on a train. I shouldn't feel anxious about getting on a bus. Yet they feel anxious. And no matter how much they breathe or how much they do the mindfulness, they're still feeling it, you know? So they have to think about where it comes from, and they have to learn to accept the feeling while they detach from that initial experience where they misintegrated in some area.
Interesting. Well, that actually kind of answers the next question, but I think we can suss out a little bit more here. So
Sure.
I claimed that emotions as such can't tell us anything about the world. They can't tell us if something is true. They simply tell us that we're feeling a certain way. They're an end result. I believe Rand called it a lightning calculator that is from your subconscious that has integrated past experiences. So if every time you see the color red, somebody shocks you with a that actually kind of gets more back into classical conditioning, but in everyday life, not in a lab experiment, if you constantly have negative reactions from people with beards, then perhaps you will get an anxious feeling around people with beards. Famously, Ayn Rand did too. But so my view is that emotions as such cannot tell us anything about reality. But you have on Twitter said a few things that make me think that perhaps you are at odds with this idea. So I'd like you to clarify that a little bit for me.
Sure. So emotions can't tell you explicitly information about reality. They're an end result. So they're an effect. The cause of the effect is what can tell you about reality. But think of, say, someone with panic disorder. They have a lot of panic attacks, and they can be rational about it all they want. They can breathe and all this stuff, but they feel constrained constantly, and it just keeps coming back and getting worse. Fighting the feeling doesn't work. So the information they're receiving from that panic is they're in a fight or flight response to something. And once they accept the feeling and then they examine the feeling and go, okay, what is the cause of it? It's kind of going backwards, because you can take, say, a thought and then have a feeling, or you take an action and then a feeling. That's like deduction. So I do this, therefore this. But in a way, you're being reductive with the emotion. So it's kind of going in reverse, where it's saying the emotion isn't telling me information, but it's a way for me to introspect into actual information or experiences that I have had. So the effect leads into other forms of information. So yeah, explicitly, it doesn't tell you much. It just tells you that you feel a certain way. It's an
Would
end
it be
result.
fair to say that while emotions can't tell us anything about the outside world, they can give us a glimpse into our own internal mechanisms? So we can say that I feel a certain way about this, but it requires additional psychological or mental work to suss out why you feel a certain way about a thing.
Yes, I think that's a good way of saying it. Like, it's an internal information problem, because we are conscious and we have identity. And I tend to distinguish between three things. You've got the mind, the body, and consciousness. And I don't mean that in the mystical sense. I mean that you can be aware of your thoughts. You don't have to be your thoughts. And what I mean by that is automatized thoughts. So like, if I tell you to not think of chocolate cake, immediately you're going to get an image of chocolate cake in your head. Because I've provided you with sensory data that has come into your mind and immediately recollects information. Now, that wasn't you consciously doing that. That was just your mind recollecting certain concepts based in relation to the actual symbol that I've given you, which is, say, chocolate cake. So if I say banana, you can immediately think of a banana. And we can notice that in our mind. We can notice how certain stimuli bring about certain images in our minds. And that's us being conscious of the organ that is our brain, and how it works. So I've lost my train of thought, but because it's quite a complicated topic.
That would be the consciousness on top of the mind, I believe.
Yeah. And
now, first of all, I started this conversation by telling you that I was on keto, and now you're bringing up images of chocolate cake and bananas. So, frankly, that's a little insulting. Because now I'm hungry.
Well, now you can focus your awareness on not doing it. That's called free will.
So I did say that I was going to bring this back up, and mostly it's for the clickbait headline. FrogMachine gives his opinion on Jordan Peterson, but he is, like it or not, a rather large figure in YouTube and part of the intellectual dark web. So what are your views on Jordan Peterson? Like I said, from a layman's point of view, I can say that he seems pretty good when he stays in his lane. When he ventures outside of psychology, his ideas they seem to become a little untethered. But when he gives advice on matters of dealing with anxiety, depression, recurring thoughts, etc., he seems to be quite knowledgeable. So would you agree with my assessment, or would you caution our listeners?
So Jordan Peterson is kind of a hard one. Like, I've listened to a fair bit of his stuff, not huge amounts. I think that he does mean well. I think that a lot of people give him a lot of crap, a lot of shit because of the things he says, and they're saying, oh, he doesn't mean well, he's very malevolent. This is true, but I do think he comes from a place of compassion. But he has a malevolent premise, and I think that is true, because when you hear the things he talks about how life is suffering and you shouldn't pursue happiness, you should pursue meaning. And what does he mean by pursuing meaning? What does pursuing meaning mean? And I think a lot of that bleeds into altruist kind of premises, because he has that Christian or Catholic background. So he wants to, provide for the community and this and that. And he's very stuck into his psychoanalysis areas, which is Jungian and all that. So I think that on a practical level, he has a lot of good advice, and a lot of it is very straightforward mainstream psychology stuff, which for a lot of people it helps. Like the clean your room thing, like, oh, clean your room, bucko. He goes into those things.
I love whenever anybody says bucko when referencing him. It's like he doesn't say it all that often, but
no, he doesn't.
It's just such a weird thing that he threw out there once or twice, and everybody's glommed onto it. I love it.
Yeah. So he says to clean your room, and what does cleaning your room do? It's you're taking action and sorting something out in your external world. You're sorting something out in reality, and that makes you feel good. It's like a small jump or a blip in your self-esteem. And then people spiral in that way because they start to act in other areas. They take steps. So he's actually giving good advice in that area, and he gives a lot of good advice in how to get rid of rumination and stuff. Though I think that when he does venture out of psychology, and he does go into philosophy in particular, and I remember at Ocon when he was talking to Salmieri, Yaron Brook and all that, some of the questions and the things he was talking about was so complicated and confusing. But I don't mean that in a really good way. He was very messy. He's kind of Kantian, but he's Jungian, and there's so many things that he goes into. And in particular, when I remember when he asked the question, like, why is a beanbag and a tree stump both a chair?
That's right. Yeah.
And I audibly laughed when he said that, because the other objectivists on the in the stadium, whatever you call it, they couldn't answer it properly. And I was like, this is a really easy question. It's just the genus of chair, and then we hierarchically go down into differentia. It's a conceptual hierarchy thing, and that's it. It's not that hard, because you have to base it off distinguishing characteristics, essentials. It's just Ayn Rand's concept formation. And no one answered it, and he throws things out like that. And people are like, wow, he's so intelligent because he thinks on a really deep level. It's like, this isn't that hard, actually. It's just that...
No, he's so intelligent. This was philosophy 101 when I was in university, when we were talking about Plato and the conceptual world and the physical world and the noumenal and that's exactly where it comes from. Oh, well, there's this concept chair, and not every chair looks exactly like it. So there must be one perfect chair, and every other chair is just a shadow of that chair. It's like, shut the hell up. No, we make up the concepts to structure our world mentally. That's all there is to it. It's not, and that did frustrate me very much. That I think it was Greg who was specifically answering him couldn't get to that point. It was almost like you took a master carpenter and then you asked him to build a birdhouse, and he was like, he just got stuck. I forget how to do this. It's so simple that that was a poor analogy, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah. It's I would say, like, to answer kind of whether people should we should take caution with him. I think that some of his practical advice has some merit, and if you've actually helped yourself and become better overall with that stuff, then good, but people also have to remember that Peterson comes from a lot of psychotherapy, and he deals with, like, psychologists deal with dark shit. The stuff that like I am going to have to deal with in the future, like people telling me their darkest secrets and the trauma they've experienced and all this stuff, so much pain and misery, that can really affect your worldview. That can really make you look at the world and go, it's a horrible place. Because when you sink yourself in those pits, you have to be aware of it and not drown yourself in it to the point where you become that. And I think that's what's happened to Peterson and his experiences in his life. And I have great sympathy for him. I know that his wife was diagnosed with cancer, and he went into rehab. And a lot of people chastised him for it, and I thought that was absolutely disgusting that people chastised him for it. Yeah, that's a tremendous hit to his life, because that's probably his top value, his wife. So I have all the sympathy in the world for him in terms of those things, and I hope that he recovers. But those kinds of things can do a number on someone's view of life, and I would suggest caution when it comes to doing things for your community, because to whom is that valuable for? Like, is it for you? Is it in your value hierarchy? Be self-interested first. Don't do things because it's in it for other people. Do things because it's in it for you.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about the malevolent universe premise. And for those that are uninitiated in objectivism, there's the malevolent universe premise and the benevolent universe premise. And malevolent basically says the world's out to get you. And the benevolent universe premise says that your values are achievable. If you work hard, you can get them. And I think one of the most bleak things I ever heard Jordan Peterson say that really showed that he has a malevolent universe premise is that the best you can do in life is to minimize suffering. And it was at that point that I stopped watching him, because that is so grossly untrue, as just you and I speaking across the internet proves. You achieving your values, me being interested in it, and interviewing you, us using this beautiful technology that so many people have put their minds towards and figured out how to solve problems so that we can just have a conversation over the internet. I can record it, put it back up on the internet. People can listen to it. We're here. We're achieving our values. We're happy. It's there for you too. I don't want to change this into an evangelical podcast, but these values, they're there. They're achievable. You can get them. You just have to actually put in the work. And it's more than just clean your room, bucko. Right? There's actually go out into the world and take the actions that are necessary to achieve whatever value you are trying to get to. So the next question I'd like to get to here is there is absolutely a cultural stigma around mental disorders. And I think that some of that is it's ebbing, right? It's going away a little bit. Sometimes I think in an unhealthy way with people flaunting their mental disorders. Like, look at me, I'm so unique that I have bipolar disorder. And sometimes in a good way where people are just talking about, hey, I have a therapy appointment and I need to whatever, or they're talking about their problems with their loved ones instead of cloistering up. Do you think it's getting better or worse? And as a follow-up, is it better or worse in Japan versus the US or Australia or wherever you were last?
I agree that to kind of elaborate a little bit, like people who tout that they have a mental disorder, I don't think that's a good thing. I think that people should be more vulnerable, and what I mean by that is be willing to take in, to connect with people, to open yourself up, and to accept that it's like, yeah, I have a past, I have a history, and that may have resulted in anxiety, or that may have resulted in depression. And I don't mean that in a life of suffering kind of way. I mean that in the fact is that your values are achievable and you're out there to go get it, and the pursuit of eudaimonia. I don't say happiness because people tend to think happiness is a hedonistic thing. I say eudaimonia, which is contentment and joy and pleasure.
I'm going to go ahead and interrupt you for just 1 second. I have eudaimonia in the original Greek tattooed across my heart.
Nice. That's awesome.
Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So you can pursue that, but those pursuits will come with ups and downs, because that is what life is. Life is life. It's just, you're going to have moments where a storm's going to weather you down, but there's always a clearing afterwards as long as you keep struggling. And that's kind of how I look at the world and go, yeah, I've been through some real deep struggles. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had some pretty nasty things happen, and it was really hard for me. But no one noticed because I was still pursuing my values. But I'm in a clearing now. It's sunny outside. It's great. But going into the question of like stigma and stuff, Japan is terrible with mental disorders because Japan only recently, like maybe 20, 30 years ago, they recently started acknowledging that depression is a thing. They called it kokoro no kaze, and kokoro no kaze means like the cold of the feelings, essentially. Like you have a feeling for your cold, you'll get over it. That's kind of the implicit thing. And their attitude to everything is to, work and gambatte. Gambatte means do your best. And work hard and just keep working and you'll be fine. And like don't bother other people with your problems. Preserve the wa, which is like the harmony in Japan. It's very collectivistic in that sense. And the stigma is going away, but very, very slowly. And it's still saying that you have a mental disorder or that you have some issues that you need to take time off work, that's still pretty frowned upon, especially taking time off work. There's a huge pressure in work culture here. And I mean, Japan has some of the highest suicide rates in the world for males. They throw themselves in front of trains. That's how bad it can be. So, yeah, they are not a bastion of healthy mental capacities in any stretch. But in terms of the US and Australia, I'd say it's doing better. People are starting to accept that, yeah, people go through stuff. They go through tragedy. They go through pain. And that's a good thing. It's accepting the fact that people struggle. And I think that leads to a more cohesive society as a whole, because once we learn that everyone goes through hard times sometimes. Oh, but everyone goes through hard times. That's reductive. Everyone goes through hard times at some point in their lives. And that's fine, as long as you continue to strive to grab the sun in your hands. That's the point of your life. Live your life to the best of its ability and, yeah, weather the storms sometimes. And, yeah, it's starting to get better, but I think we do need to work on distinguishing between being proud of a mental illness and just saying, look, I have a mental illness, or I have, say, schizophrenia, or I have autism, and I mean that in a neutral, normalized sense, not in the stupid, politically incorrect sense. I don't use that. I think that's quite insulting, actually. But acknowledging that maybe you have a problem metaphysically, or acknowledging that you are struggling with something, that's good. But holding it proudly on your chest as if it's something to be proud of, I don't think that's very good. I don't think it's very productive, because you're trying to make it as if you are somehow important because of that fact. No, it's just a fact of you. It's just a fact of you. Now live your life to the best of your abilities, even with that mental illness in you or that metaphysically given fact. There's no moral evaluation behind it. I think the answer to that was a little messy because it's a pretty difficult question. Though I have no judgment when someone goes through horrible things or is struggling with anxiety or panic, or they have schizophrenia and stuff, because that stuff's tough. And I mean, that's the area where I'm going in. I'm trying to normalize it and go, look, don't see it as bad or a good thing, and don't take pride in it. Just accept it for what it is, as a metaphysically given fact, and then live your life. Just live your life. That's it.
And then, of course, there's the opposite of that, where people use it as an excuse and don't try to get better. They just say, I have this, period, and not I'm working on it, or they don't go to therapy. They don't try to, quote, normalize or get to what they consider or what could be considered a healthy mental state. They just say, I have social anxiety, therefore I'm never leaving my house again. That is also unhealthy. That is, I see it as just wallowing.
Yes, and it's also the case of, it's kind of deterministic as well, because some people say, well, I have psychosis or I have bipolar, so if you can't handle me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best. I hate that fucking quote, because no, you can be a decent human being regardless of your stature, regardless of your emotional state. If you have bipolar, okay, I can respect that completely. You can be upfront with me, because that provides so much clarity to our friendship or our relationship, and if I want to date you or I want to hang out with you and stuff, no worries. Just don't use it as an excuse to do stupid shit. Like, if you're like, well, I've got bipolar, that's why I decided to tell all my friends to fuck off and kill themselves or whatever. It's just bipolar. It's like, no, you had a choice. You know, if you're struggling, be open and be vulnerable about it, but don't judge and attack other people and then use the excuse of a mental illness as justification for it. I think that's really unproductive.
I know a few people with bipolar in my life, and the difference in the ways that they approach that challenge is really telling about what they view about their life, how they view life. And some people just wallow in it in the down times, and when they're manic, they go out and buy 1,000 scratch tickets. You're like, God, this is really destructive. And then other people, they try to harness that mania in a good way, and they try to get a lot of things done while they have it, and they have a lot of good ideas that they write down. And when they have the depression part of manic depressive, they tend to try to cope with that by doing physical things. This is one gentleman I'm thinking of specifically who will go on a hike once a week just to try and get the blood moving, and tries to raise the depression and lower the mania, and to really smooth things out. And he's very productive in his life. So it's really how you attack it. So I'd like to end this interview with one last question. What do you think is the most important thing that someone could learn to improve their mental health?
It's a good question, because there's a lot of things I could say, but...
And I'm sorry we're out of time. Tune in next... No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Be kind to yourself. And I say that from personal experience. What I mean by being kind to yourself is be okay with where you are in the present. And I don't mean accept that you're in a accept your present moment and don't do anything. I'm saying accept the fact that you are in that moment right now, but then ask yourself what needs doing next. If you feel like you're in a bad place, if you feel like you're not doing well, or something has gone wrong, or you're in grief because you've lost someone or a pet or something like that, it's okay to feel that. It's okay to feel those things, and okay to notice where you are in the present moment, but just remember that there's always a future, and aim towards getting back up and moving forward. Always be moving forward, and just care for yourself in that way. Be kind, and don't judge yourself for having bad thoughts or emotions that are unpleasant. Just care for yourself, recognize that those things are a part of you at this point in time, and then ask yourself what needs to be done next.
You heard it here first, folks, from the mouth of FrogMachine. It's not be excellent to each other, but be excellent to yourself. FrogMachine, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to speak with us. I honestly enjoyed it every time I speak with you. It is very clarifying, and I hope we can talk to you again sometime soon. Please check out the show notes, folks, for a link to FrogMachine's book, and give it a gander. I'll also put a link to his excellent YouTube channel. If you would like me to cover a specific topic, I can be reached on Twitter at @AmericanitisTech. That's the @ American, ITISTEK, or at americanitis@techside.net. Please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts, and take the time to leave us a review and comment. We have a Patreon page, which enables you to support the podcast for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/techside. Show notes are available at techside.net/americanitis. We thank you all for listening. Later days.